My name's Bruce Robertson. I'm the director of the museum for a little longer. And I'm going to hand it over now to Sylvia Perea, who is our brand new curator of architecture and design. As many of you may know, we have one of the world's biggest and greatest archives of architectural drawings and architectural materials. And it is always a thrill to make that historic archive connect to contemporary architecture and living architects and practitioners.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, even if it's in a compressed way. I have to start this presentation by thanking Robin Donaldson for being here, for accepting our invitation, as well as his staff, because they've been tremendously helpful in organizing all, this satellite lecture. So thank you. And thank you as well to our curatorial assistant, Winston Brown, who has been helping out with the process. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Shane Mahan, who is regional executive for Kitchell, which is our sponsor, and which has enabled us to have this series of events every once in a while. So thank you so much, Shane, for your presence. So inviting Robin Donaldson to lecture with us or for us was a long due debt that we had pending in our agendas. Robin Donaldson graduated from UCSB with a degree of Bachelor of Arts with an emphasis on architecture, and correct me if I'm wrong. And he studied under David Gebhardt, who was the founding father of our museum. He then went on to SciArc to become an architect and work with Morphosis. And ever since, he's been visiting our archive quite a lot of times to do research. And he has even curated and contributed to the design of several exhibitions, very well received, by the way, among them the Paul Tuttle exhibition that we had in 2001. But of course, our debt with Robin extends our relationship to honor and applaud his capital contribution to redefine the modern architecture in Southern California. So along with his partners, Russell Shubin and Mark Hirschman, he and his office, his firm, Shubin Donaldson, and along 25 years of career and splendid background, he has developed a new sense for a California lifestyle. This new sense stems from the modern legacy that other architects implemented and developed in the past, such as Richard Neutra, Roland Coate Jr., and Tom Main, among many, many others, and expands the welcome and the warm welcome that this legacy had internationally over the years. This new sense for California lifestyle, in my modest view, stems from the integration of 5 architectural values, or 5 architectural capacities. First, the capacity to, in a way, awaken the senses by modulating the space and the light, and by curating a very select palette of materials and textures. Second, the ability to favor the inhabitants of their architecture's well-being and health. And by those architectures, I mean commercial buildings, residential buildings, and projects that are related to hospitality. Third, the ability to tell the truth about the constructive process of architecture. Robin Donaldson does not hide how things are built. He does not disguise them or try to hide them. He expresses and embraces construction as it is. Fourth, the ability to experiment and through research come out with solutions that expand the conceptual and technological boundaries of the discipline. And last but not least, also the capacity to live within nature harmonically and even increase the resources of energy in the planet. But of course, the integration of these 5 values does not happen in a vacuum in Shubin Donaldson's practice. They are very often informed by serendipitous thoughts, kind of remote souvenirs, and kind of unconscious references. And as I hope we see today with your lead, we are eager to discover how those subtle references become more meaningful and express themselves in their truth once we see them from afar and we gain some perspective. So we're eager to gain that perspective with your help today. Thank you, Robin.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Sylvia. That was beyond my expectations by a long shot. I did like the five kind of values and points of view, and I'm going to touch on those tonight. But I'm going to touch on them in the context of 3 houses, and not 3 houses of mine. One house is a house that we're doing, but the other 2 are houses that have had a huge influence on me. And I think they're very important houses in our community. And I think that all of those values you just mentioned are embodied in these, but in different ways and in different interesting ways that we're going to see the sequence. One of the things I want to do tonight is introduce these houses. Alexander Residence, 1976 by Roland Coate. Some people know it today. It'll get referred to as a mud house sometimes, but it's the home that Steve Martin owns in Romero Canyon. Fortunately, Mr. Martin's taking good care of it. The other house is the Crawford Residence, and a house built, finished in 1990, Morphosis. This was a house that I was actually the project architect on. I was intimately involved in from the beginning until today, still. And then the third house has a number of names. We call it Pepper Hill Residence on our website. It's a house that's starting to unveil itself, and it is a house that has evolved in a way where recently I've started to discover, it might even be, subconsciously, this link between the Crawford residence and then back to the Alexander residence. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Underneath all of this, by the way, one of the things I discovered as I talked about these homes and dug into this, there's really 3 women that are really who this talk is dedicated to, and to whom, without these interest, the consent, the courage of these women, these 3 houses wouldn't have happened. And I've gained that insight from talking to Nancy Alexander, who's here tonight. Thank you for being here, Nancy. Appreciate it. My working over all those years with Joan Crawford and Bill Crawford, and I know it was Joan that was driving the aesthetic ship and was involved even in the hiring of Morphosis. I mean, she just made that decision, right? Wouldn't have happened this way without Joan. And then, of course, working with Linda and Bruce, who are here tonight, Linda Wyman, and the amazing work that we're doing on this house. And without Linda's leadership, courage again, I don't know that this thing would be happening. And I think the community is the better for these 3 women and for doing these projects I'm talking about it. And as we go through, we'll talk more about that. So hopefully I didn't embarrass anybody. I also, though, I want to thank not only, obviously, Linda and Joan, Joan's not here, but you're standing in for Joan, right, Susie? And Nancy. I appreciate the museum, Shane, you guys working to put together these discussions, and there's been a lot of interesting people. I'm really concerned in the community that we're elevating the discourse, particularly around design. We have planning issues. we have architectural issues, we have cultural issues that architects deal with, and I really think we need to elevate that conversation within the community. I think sometimes there's this tendency to think, oh, all of the brains are outside of this community. But no, there's a lot of really good, competent people within this community. The more we have these talks and foster that, the better. So I really appreciate that. I also appreciate my staff for helping me put this on. My family's here tonight. Aaron, my dad's up, and my 2 sons, one of which I'm missing, Payne and Reed. Thanks for being here, guys. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little prologue. Before we jump into the 3 houses, there's a little background I want to get into. Anybody know who this guy is? Yeah, raise your hand. This is David, yeah. Dr. David Gebhard. Now, think about Dr. Gebhard is that he's the one, when I was at UCSB, he's the one that got me thinking about architecture and the potential of architecture beyond just making buildings. He introduced a cultural relevance to architecture, the artistic side, and it really opened my eyes. At the time, I was thinking I was going to do an MFA, maybe be a painter, something like that. But the more I dealt with Dr. Gebhard, the more I saw what the possibilities were within architecture. This was all going on about 1979 to 81. And in 1980, and I spent a lot of time in the University Art Library. And I know it exists to this day. And one day I walk in the art library and there's this Domus magazine with this character on the cover. Anybody know who this guy is? At the time, 1980, this was mind-blowing to see Frank Gehry on the cover of a magazine, of an international design magazine. And more interesting, there was something about young architects of California. Now, I'm a budding student getting interested in architecture, and this magazine blew my mind. Because inside it was one project in particular I found really fascinating, this photograph, the 2468 house, by a character named Tom Main, or a company called Morphosis. I didn't even know who Tom Main was, really. Saw the name, and I saw Michael Rotundi's name. But something about this was compelling. This is while Michael Graves is, the Grand Poobah, and here's these guys from LA doing some really interesting stuff. And I'm thinking, maybe there's something going on with these guys I need to learn about. About the same time, this photograph came out, and this photograph has to do with an exhibit that occurred just 6 months before that magazine cover. And this exhibit was at SciArc. And each one of these guys later had a big impact on me, and I'm going to touch on that now so we can kind of set the stage here a little bit. Obviously, Tom, he was the founder of SciArc, Morphosis. At the time, I didn't know that someday I'd be working for him and all of that. Ended up working with him closely on the Crawford residence. Another guy in this picture is, anybody know who this is? Eric Moss. Eric, another professor at SciArc, ended up being the director. He was one of my studio instructors. I went to Mexico on a famous trip with him to Merida, which was a disaster. Eric got sick. And I eventually ended up working on interiors of his buildings. Eric, these buildings he did, they figured out that no architect could do the interiors without getting in trouble with Eric, but I could kind of figure Eric out. And so they started giving them to me. Robert Mangurian. Robert was a real character, another SciArc professor, my thesis advisor. When I met him, he had a white lab coat on, white shirt, white pants, and carried a flare gun. And these were the kind of characters that were running around at the time. Craig Hodges was his partner, later SciArc professor, and so on. Coy Howard, another one of my instructors at SciArc. But all these guys were part of this exhibit. All of these guys were part of that article in Domus magazine. Fred Fisher. Now, Fred was a little bit of a different cat. He wasn't from SciArc. He was from UCLA. We weren't really sure if we could trust this guy. He ended up being the director of Otis, asked me to teach there, and I refused and kind of pissed him off, but that's all right. And today, Tom says, well, Fred's got a conventional practice, but Fred's got a great practice and does amazing, beautiful work. And finally, Frank Gehry. Frank kind of casts a shadow over everybody. Now, I'm setting this table because, Tom used to loan me to Frank occasionally to work on competitions, but I don't think Frank has any idea who I am. Now, this was the poster from that exhibit that went on with all of those people that were in that exhibit. And one name in particular catches the eye, which is Roland Coate Jr. Roland at the time, sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but you can kind of catch the names. But Roland at the time was one of the more senior members of this group because Roland had actually built a building. One building called the Alexander Residence up in Montecito. So this is 1979. That building had already been up for 3 years. He had already been on the cover of PA Magazine. And he was brought in really by Tom. He was a friend of Tom's, and Tom talked about him a lot. And so we're going to be seeing more about Roland here in a minute with this amazing residence. Roland was already painting. He was a painter. Apparently, after this exhibit, he really decided just to focus on painting. And I'm not sure if he really did much architecture again that I'm aware of. Some, yeah. I got to know Roland because we were building the Crawford residence. He came up and he would visit, and he would come to my office and talk about how much he hated practicing architecture and was telling me that I should never do it and so on. And these are some of his paintings, so you get a sense of his paintings. So this guy again. So about this time, I'm starting to think about where I'm going. I'm going to go to graduate school or what I'm going to do. I go in and talk to him, and he says, SciArc. He was the one who said, as I'm asking him about Harvard, Columbia, and Princeton because Michael Graves, I'm thinking this is where to go. He goes, no. You better go check out SciArc. And I had in my head that this was SciArc. Anybody see this picture? There's a lot of hippies. It was called the New School. I was not too sure about this deal. And the one guy in this picture is a guy named Mike Rotundi. And I ended up, thanks to Dr. Gebhard, he kind of set up me going down to Santa Monica and meeting with Mike. And I went down, here's a better picture of Mike, at least I'll own that. And eventually he ended up being the SciArc director and broke up with Tom and so on. But I went down and talked to Mike, and I got enrolled in the possibility of going to the school. This is where I went to talk to him. This was where I pulled up. I wasn't sure that this was really the building, but this was SciArc, and this was this warehouse. And this is what it looked like inside. Now I've thrown some names up here because within this building and within this very space, these are the people that were coming through at this time, most of which hadn't even designed a building yet, but they were on the faculty. They were coming and talking. They were spending weeks with us. These are all names that we know today, obviously. Kulahaza, all these guys. But it turned out to be a very interesting place to go. I eventually talked Mike into accepting me. It actually took a while. And I think I got a letter out of Dr. Gebhard that put him over the edge, but I'm not really sure if that really did it or not. So I started at SciArc, and within 3 weeks, Mike comes in, actually called me and said, morphosis. I mean, literally, I'd been there like 3 weeks. And from what I heard was graduate students that came in the first year, one person got picked to go work at morphosis, and I got picked. So thanks to Mike Rotundi, I'm now in morphosis, and I'm part of this motley crew, which at the time this is a picture a few years later from when I started. When I started, there was like 4 people there, 5 people literally. And that's including Mike and Tom. So for the next, I think one of the main reasons, first thing I did that I was there is I worked on the Cohen residence, which was the project that Joanne Crawford liked. And she told Tom, I want a house like that. Now, I show this because I don't think she got exactly that, if anybody's familiar with this. Although she did get a barrel vault, and we'll see that in a few minutes. I was brought in to make models, do drawings. Guess how much I was paid? It was great experience, and as I always say, interning is a tough deal, but I really felt like I was the one getting the benefit out of it at the end of the day. One of the things we did there is we made a lot of models. made a lot of fabrications. I'm going to talk more about that later. A lot of artifacts and fabricate. We basically approached architecture from the standpoint, at least we can make the models and drawings because we never knew if we were going to get a building built at this stage. Literally, there were very few buildings built. So let's jump into the first house and talk about the Alexander residence. Now, I'm not a historian, and I want to qualify everything I say. It's really from the standpoint of me as a practicing architect who is looking at these projects and how this has an impact on how I'm practicing today. So you're going to have to take some of this from that standpoint, and so there's my qualifier. Just get a point of reference, the three projects, Crawford Residence, Alexander House, and what we in the office sometimes call the Woodley Residence. They're actually in vastly different areas of Montecito, but they're close enough that I would say they are part of a community in that they're dealing with similar issues in terms of the context. This project, it started, I believe, around 1972. And when I was talking to Nancy, and I had a nice conversation with Nancy a few weeks ago about the process of this, and she mentioned a very interesting building that had an influence on this. And this notion of brutalism. And this building still exists. You can visit it in London. And you also mentioned something interesting. I found that you started with Paul Tuttle and did a design with Paul that they ended up not executing. And Paul, at the time, was doing mainly furniture, but also did architecture. And a lot of people knew and loved Paul. And I got to know Paul well. I'll talk about that in a second. But really what they ended up doing is finding, from what I understand, you found Jesse through some friends, and it was related to the Mud House, MUDD, down in West LA. Design must have begun 72, 73, somewhere in there. Because you were built by 75, 76. Does that sound about right? Interestingly, when we'll talk about the construction in a minute, but this project we kept an eye on when we were designing the Crawford residence. And Tom talked about it, and it was our beacon of hope in terms of being able to do something interesting in Montecito. We did not think that might be possible, except for this one example. Because we were cautioned that the Montecito Board of Architectural Review was not going to like anything modern. But that only gave Tom Main more charge to go ahead. Building topographic integration is the main concern about how you live on that site and literally living inside that site. Concrete is the main material. Nancy mentioned very pragmatically it had a lot to do with the fire and with the resilience. And some of the reading I did, not only were they concerned with fires, but they were concerned with mudslides and drought and other issues like that not surprisingly, we're still dealing with, maybe even more than anybody could have imagined at that time. This house and Linda's house, that's one thing they have in common. When we talk about commonalities, is a concern about resiliency and how strong these structures are. Obviously a beautiful building. I found this quote interesting. This came out of a Roland Coate interview for that exhibition I was just talking about, where Roland said, "The house has an emotional connection with Mother Earth. It's a trip through the underworld in the sense Dante wrote about the underworld." And obviously a very romantic notion about the house. The house ended up on the cover of Progressive Architecture magazine, and I believe this was August of 76. So fairly soon after it was construction was completed. A beautiful article by Thomas Hines, who actually is a historian professor from UCLA, liked the house and admitted that in the article. And why I say that is because a lot of people, it was controversial. People weren't sure if they liked this or not. And obviously, those of us from SciArc and in this milieu of architects, we loved it. We didn't understand how anybody could not like it. But Thomas Hines came to the defense of it. Apparently, even architects were so wild about it in certain quarters. This is another page from the article and photographs. I think some were by Jesse, and I think some were taken by the architect.
Mainly Roman's photographs.
Yeah.
And the area is Jesse's. Everything else.
Oh, there, everything else.
Was,
The photographs of the interior are very interesting because you get a sense of, I love the quilts on the wall. It's actually being domesticated. There's a Paul Tuttle chair down the lower photograph on the left-hand side. You get a sense of the community that you were involved with, Nancy, through the arts and design. And I believe you made those quilts, is that right?
no.
What are they? I thought you were making quilts.
No, they were old quilts.
Yeah,
and
okay.
quilts.
I was glad to find this progressive architecture article because there isn't, when you go online to look up information on this house, it's difficult to find very good information. Most of the photographs you find were the early kind of Wayne McCall photographs, which I believe that's these photographs here, or you find the real estate agent's photographs from when Mr. Martin had the house for sale. And the house it was much better when Jesse and Nancy owned it and furnished it. But obviously very poetic. It takes advantage of this amazing site. Fire resistant. I love this photograph. I believe that's the dining room table, right? It's embedded in the house. Nobody can take that or that's a photo from today. And I had more photos from today, but I kind of didn't want to disturb too much with the floor plan, interestingly, a courtyard that's completely enclosed up on the top of that hill, which was a really smart thing to do. And I think there was a lot of sensitivity to the site. There must have been a lot of discussion about the winds and about the climatic conditions up there on that site. The house has a circular motif and then radiates out from the center, like the master bedroom, the dining area, and so on, opens up to the view around it. There was a film made called The Mud House. You can find this on Vimeo. Really terrific film. I'm going to save you having to look for it. We're not going to watch it tonight, but I pulled a bunch of stills from it. It was made by Jesse Alexander, Nancy's husband. He's a photographer, incredible photographer. That'd be fun to get a sense of kind of where Jesse was coming from in terms of his commitment aesthetically. And amazing photographs from this period all through his life. Website is terrific if you go through it. I have this book on my shelf, recommend it if you can find it. Old photographs. He has many, many books and documents all available. But obviously Jesse and Nancy were very plugged in culturally, aware of what was going on in the arts, in architecture, and in fact picking Roland Coate was a very interesting choice for them to have made at that stage. They could have gone with a much more established architect. This is Jesse with a friend of his. Now in the film, interestingly, it has panoramas of intersections, freeways, and things like that. There was an attitude about the concrete, about the rawness of the concrete, and about the anonymity of freeway design. In other words, you don't really feel a designer. It just is what it is. And that's really what Roland Coate Jr. was trying to go for with the concrete. It kind of is what it is. And that attitude around construction, revealing what a building is made, how a building is made, is part of those values that Sylvia was talking about. Great photo. I'm just going to fly through these for a second, because we're going to look at some construction photos in a little bit. But now you get to see the house a little bit from stills for how Jesse looked at it from his film. I'm gonna kind of. I have a million of these. I couldn't stop capturing them because and you see so much, from somebody like Tadao Ando and people later who are much later, how Roland was really thinking ahead in terms of how the materials were, this relationship to interior, exterior, and the purity of the structure. Big pieces of glass, very difficult to get them in there. So now I'm going to jump to Crawford residence. We're going to come back and visit this house in a minute, very briefly in a comparison. Now, this house, 1990, I started working on it in 1986. That's when Joan and Bill commissioned Morphosis to start. That actually, I'd just finished my graduate program at SciArt. Tom called me and said, hey, come work on this house. And that came back in after I graduated and started again. And I'd been working with them all along, but Tom said, you got to really come back and do this. Again, a relationship to the topography and the landscape. All three of these houses, in my mind, really are as much about the landscape as they are about architecture. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Different organizational systems, the system of cardinal points, view orientations, things like that. You'll see that in the plans. And also the series of linear progression of solids and voids that started to be a relationship to structure and the express structure of the residence. And eventually we started talking about a circular wall that helped define private land versus the territory, kind of the surrounding territory around the project, which is a theme, I think, in all three of these projects. Series of models were done. This is actually, I took this photo, I stole these photos when I was at Bill and Joanne's one day, because they have these models, which is terrific that they're taking care of them. Who knows what would happen to them at Morphosis. We actually did a framing model. These are models I built during design. We figured out where every stick of wood would go. Eventually took it out to the site so we could figure out how to build the house. I bring this up because you're going to see a different approach to building in a minute, but this was very analog. Another model that I built, this was a fiberglass base that I made. At the time I was interested in fiberglass and so on. Working on a project of Morphosis meant you made things. You worked in the model shop, you made drawings. We had teams of people that would come, interns during the summer, they would help me. And probably for 2 to 3 years, we basically worked on drawings. This is a Tom drawing, post-rationalization, by the way, after the project was done. Yeah. This drawing I did with some interns during the summer. And this is when we started to do what Tom later called drawdles, which is a combination between a model and a drawing. It's essentially a 3-dimensional drawing. And this was made out of MDF, and we had interns sanding and cutting MDF for a whole summer, and God knows, MDF was not good stuff to breathe. But we did a lot, like I said, a lot of drawings, sections of the building we studied, it upside down and backwards, all by hand, all analog, all drawn with pen and ink on Mylar. Each one of these drawings would take weeks, literally. This is a photo from a new sculpture. It was a show at MoCA in 2013 called A New Sculpturalism. Is that right? They had a room. Tom ended up curating the show and promoting the show, and Morphosis had a pretty good showing at the show, as you might imagine. And he had a room dedicated to the Crawford residence. But these are all things that I made when I was working there. Now, why I bring that up is that eventually we were going to run into this guy again. Because after doing all these models and drawings, we needed to go to the Montecito Board of Architectural Review and try and get this house through. And there was no indication that we'd be able to. Mike Rotundi said to me, well, you know David Gebhard, why don't you give him a call and kind of soften him up a little bit before we come into the meeting. And I said, I don't think he wants to hear from me. I think he needs to hear from you or Tom. So eventually I organized it and I got him to talk to David Gebhard, and David Gebhard didn't give him a warm and fuzzy about it. He said, well, we'll see when you come up. So we were a little nervous driving up to Santa Barbara, and we basically brought this model. So we came into the room and made our presentation, and it was silence. The board didn't even know what to say. And they stood there, and to me it seemed like half an hour went by. Finally, he clears his throat and says, well, your reputation precedes you. I think this is a remarkable piece of architecture, and I fully support it. And all the other board members kind of looked at him like, what? And they all then went, okay, I guess we're good with it. And there's only one person who had a comment, and it was Bob Easton, of course. And Bob suggested that one of the we had these redwood pylon pieces, and Bob said, well, I think maybe those would be better done with redwood shingles. And Mike Rotuni started to get into an argument with him, and I kind of shushed Mike and said, thank you, Bob, and we got out of the room. But we basically had our approval. We didn't change anything. We didn't change a single stick of the design, nothing. They had no comment. There was nothing they could say. That led to this. That's me. That's hair. This is my office. Because literally almost like a week later, I was up on living, and my office was in this basically as a trash container. That's for my sons. This is a telephone book right there. And that's a telephone, and that had a rotary dial on it. We didn't even have a fax machine. Eventually we got a fax machine. That was down at Paul Franz's office. Paul was the builder. My job here, also see this is an electric eraser. This is a drawing board. My job was to stay ahead of the builders. Because basically, the drawings we did were not really that great. You saw all those pretty drawings. You can't really build a building from those drawings. And we got on site, and I got on site, and I realized we didn't have this thing properly drawn. And so I was on the site every day from when it was an empty field until, well, today, but until Bill and Joanne moved in. And I drew notebooks full of details, drawings, trying to stay ahead of these guys. I'd be up all night, trying to stay ahead of the surveyor to lay out the house at the beginning. And it was 2.5 years of really my second graduate degree, maybe even a PhD in construction, because I had to stay ahead of the construction. And I learned everything about what these guys needed, and I made mistakes. They covered for me. I had steel beams show up that were too long, and they'd cut them. And shop drawings, and I had to check every shop drawings and dimensions, I did it all. During construction, the project was very challenging to build in that it was basically like building a boat. It was on a grid, on a 16-foot grid. Sorry, these pictures are ones I took as it was under construction. There might be some people in here who remember when it was under construction. Yeah, I figured you would soon. Susan worked on the landscape. And I think it was around this time, Susan, you started to get involved. It was during this.
I remember being in the small trailer.
You remember the trailer? Yeah, me having hair. So the construction went on for 2.5, 3 years. I basically lived on site. Here it is today from Google Earth. Little did we know someday there would be satellites covering the Earth, taking photographs. We call this the fifth facade. And we got concerned with the fifth facade facing the sky out of doing models and always looking at models. And I know that Roland Coate Jr. was concerned with the fifth facade, probably from doing models, looking at the top of the building. And the building we're doing at Bruce and Linda, we're concerned with the fifth facade as well. But little did we know that anybody in the world could go on and look like we can today. There's a series of photographs after the house was done. It also was in Progressive Architecture magazine on the cover. This was, I think, 91, November of 91. By then, I'd already started to do a little bit of my own thing up here in Santa Barbara, and then I had this project on the cover. Tom says the guest house was mine because when we designed the guest house, Tom was flying around. He was in Europe, he was everywhere, and I just had to design this thing. And he would look at it and kind of pick at it a little bit, but otherwise he had nothing to say about it. And it ended up on the cover, which I always thought was funny. Nice, great article. The project at the time, we had Japanese students that would show up in buses and cameras and climb the fences, and was getting Bill and Joanne a little bit of heartburn about how many people really wanted to get in the house and see it. Not only this, was numerous books, and it was just all over the place. It, to this day, has been kept up very well by Bill and Joanne, fortunately. This is, I think, where Susie and Greg live now, right? It's in the guest house, which, again, yeah, that's my favorite. That's a picture of it from the outside. Well, I want to go through this for a minute. That's inside. Again, my favorite little house. That's the shower. Is it still like that? If you drive by it from the street today, this is what you'll see. More landscapes growing up around it. That's a piece of that building that Bob Eason said should have redwood shingles where that redwood siding is. These are photographs by Kim Zwarts. Kim Zwarts was a Dutch photographer who came out and is now a very prominent photographer, did a beautiful series of photographs of the details and the kind of the attitude and expression of materials of the house. Very much about Southern California notion of materials that are exposed. They'll do what they're going to do over the years. The copper gets a patina. The concrete's going to get stained. The redwood's going to go. That was the attitude. You let it go and let it evolve. I think Bill Crawford had a hard time with that, especially the wood. Some more images that show. Image when it was finished. Here's a picture of a motley crew during construction. That's Tom in the middle, the tall guy. Me on the right. Will Sharp, dear friend of mine, to the left, and another friend of mine, Beth Munns, who was also kind of helping out on the project a bit, and they came up to visit. People would come up to visit me. I think even Sam is in here somewhere. Sam's one of them. Sam's a fellow Morphosis refugee. So I'm just going to take a quick little detour here for a second about this guy. Because one of the things I think people are curious is what happened to him, after this. After finishing the house, I decided I wanted to stay in Santa Barbara for a little break. And at the time, I'd been working at Morphosis, going to school, doing everything. I thought, Santa Barbara's not such a bad place. Maybe I'll hang out here for a month or two, and then I'll go back. Tom was a little bent out of shape, and he said, that's okay. You go ahead and do that. That was 30 years ago. This is my group today. That's me in the middle with my hair's gone. We now, our office now, we have an office here. After I stopped working at Morphosis, in that little trailer you saw me in, I met a guy named Russell Shubin who came up to visit. He was friends with some other people from Morphosis, and we eventually became partners, and that's where Shubin Donaldson came from. And we've been partners basically since around that time. It's been 26, 27 years. Russell, fortunately, was up for living in LA, and I wanted to practice in LA, but I wasn't so wild about living in LA. So Russell has been in LA the whole time. Most of our work over the years has been actually in LA. I probably consider myself as much a Los Angeles architect as I do a Santa Barbara architect. But the partnership has survived. We now have about 65 employees. We have 3 offices. The main office is in Culver City. We have an office up here, and then we have an office in Irvine. And over those years, we've done a lot of work. A shameless plug for our book, Live Plus Work. The book came out in 2010. what the book really touches on was our practice. Really, the underlying theme of our practice over the years has been how people live and how people work, particularly regionally in Southern California. We do work all over, and we've done work in Mexico, we've done work in the Middle East, Europe, East Coast, West Coast, but we're proudly regional in the sense that those 5 values that you talked about, Sylvia, those are our values wherever we are, wherever we go. Another shameless plug for another book. Recently, our practice, my practice, I've been directing it more and more into the artifacts that we produce as part of the process of doing buildings. And you're going to see more about that in a second. And this is a book recently we did about a series of prints, lithographs, and silk screens that we did based on three different projects, one of which being one of the projects you're going to see now. So we're going to talk about Pepper Hill Residence. This project, this is probably, Bruce and Linda, I think the first time I've talked about it in public. And I'm going to talk about the design process. I'm going to talk about the structure itself, about how we're going to make it. I'm going to talk about the construction and about the differences in doing a house like this today versus doing the Crawford residence or even the Alexander residence. And actually, Crawford and Alexander, in terms of technologies and so, are very close. But those years from Crawford to now, there's been a massive change in how we practice. And you'll get a sense of that in a second. This is a kind of a teaser photograph that we released to Santa Barbara Magazine last issue or so. Didn't identify the project. We just said, I think there's something about shooting Donaldson. But this is the world we're going into here. First of all, really, like I said, the building's really about landscape as much as it is about the building and how it integrates with the earth. It's also about how Bruce and Linda live, how they entertain. It's an aspirational effort, just the way the Alexander residence was and the Crawford residence. Those client, Nancy, Joan and Bill, and Nancy and Jesse and Joan and Bill, Bruce and Linda, in my opinion, all have an interest in contributing something and doing something interesting and unique, pushing the edge of what architecture and living is about. And this house, like others, has pushed it a bit. Some of the things we've talked about before are embodied in this house. The resiliency. There's more of a conversation today about sustainability, about the energy consumption and how the project uses water and things like that. Obviously, the relationship to the landscape and topography. Again, concrete is the main material. This had to do with resilience as well as just the pragmatics of the form making that we did thanks to computers and things like that. Has to do with the hilltop, which you'll see in a second. Aerial photograph. It is adjacent to, most people know this now, it's public, that it's adjacent to the old Brooks estate here and contiguous to this property. This is a rendering, if you were going to approach the building from the Brooks estate, from the west looking east. Again, a structure that's buried, but maybe buried in a way that implies a completion of the hill. This is an image that we actually showed the Board of Architectural Review. The intention of this building is eventually when you drive by, someone would drive by and maybe think it was a hill, except for maybe some curious carve-outs that I'm not even convinced you'll be able to see someday. That's partly, by the way, why the Board of Architectural Review had a similar reaction to this building that they did to the Crawford residence. They basically didn't know what to say. Except there were some comments, mainly the comments were around landscape and a concern about will the landscape really work on the roof and had we really figured that out? Obviously that was the fundamental aspect of the design and our thesis is that this thing is going to bury into the hill, and we had to prove that essentially. Otherwise, not a comment that I took anyway. There's a little sequence here of renderings just coming into the project. This is what you'll see someday when you're walking on the entry to the project. To the left, that area where you see the car hanging, that's one of Bruce's Azetas, is a gallery space that's adjacent, just off the entry. This is a view as you come through the front door essentially and come into the house. Again, the concrete form generated mainly through a digital exercise supported with physical models that we printed models essentially. A view from someday Linda's going to be doing pottery down there, looking up, gazing up at the house. In terms of the plan, the land is a 4-acre site. There's a whole series of grids underneath that we established that have to do with north, south, east, west, the cardinal points, has to do with where the sun's coming up, the sun's going down, has to do with view angles. There's views, for instance, in this area out towards the harbor. There's views here that look back up at the Gray Home estate, which is now actually part of the project and is going to be contiguous to this project. Views here that look out towards the mountains, views here that look in another direction. So a whole series of view angles at the same time, understanding equinox, for instance, the sun will be coming up right along a line over here. Solstice, it's coming on this line right here. There's things like that that are embedded into the project and again have to do with where it sits on the earth. This is a roof plan. I'm back to that fifth facade. You'll see a model of this in a second. Some people ask me about the scale. This is a 747 parked on top of it. Get a sense of the size. This is the roof plan. Again, that fifth facade looking down on the house. You'll actually be able to inhabit the roof. This is the main floor plan, which consists of a big gathering area here in the middle of the house, a gym, kitchen, dining room, master bedroom suite, all of the kind of things that you need to live comfortably. The house then goes down, kind of embeds itself in the earth. We call this the basement, but you won't really feel like you're in a basement. You'll see in a second. Theater, entertainment area, guest bedrooms, service side, and a little area here for a few cars for Bruce. We also have an area called the Avocado Courtyard, called the Avocado Courtyard, which is a courtyard that opens off of this area down here. I found it interesting when looking at the Alexander residence plans, that notion of the courtyard. We felt a similar kind of impetus to do a courtyard on the top of this ridge. We do think of this house as being on top of a ridge, by the way. This is a diagram that we showed the Montecito Board of Architectural Review, part of argument for our house. This is what was being planned on this 4-acre site, which was a big, you-know-what. And we came and said, we're actually not even going to go as tall as this. We're going to make this mound. We're going to complete this hilltop that had been just brutally cut off and in preparation for this estate that was being planned there. And we're going to complete this hill, essentially. In fact, we were so interested in that, we have a section that goes all the way down to sea level, and we have a 424-foot radius that completes the house and the ridge at the top. Again, another reference to the geological position on the earth and so on. These are some of the drawings that we showed the Montecito Board of Architectural Review. These are honest elevations, but very difficult to show this house in elevation. This is from the south elevation. The west elevation, this is the elevation that faces the Gray Home estate, the old Brooks property. And this is the north elevation that neighbors might see from the ridge on the other side. Some of the sectional aspects, just to point out, the main living level is basically at this original level where that pad was. And then we've cut down. So when you go out to the site today, the site's actually been cut down to this lower level. And they're building up from that level. And then we're going to push dirt back over the house. And we have a bit of a pile of dirt off to the north of the house, if anybody's noticed that. This is a rendering. This is actually one that Bruce produced. We have this in a three-dimensional model, and Bruce has brought it into a rendering machine that they use for very high-end video games, which has turned out to do a really beautiful job of rendering. And you can fly through it. Now, back to my sketch. I started doing sketches about this sectional relationship of the house and how this would express itself within the house. And we started developing, and we're interested in a series of swoops and moves that would not only support this concrete dome, but it would start to define spaces within the house. Those sweeps were generated from a series of sectional cuts around the house. And the computer actually started to make these shapes. You see it on the right there. Had to do with amplitude that related to the sectional aspect of the building. And these sweeps started to create different forms throughout the house. And as we go through, we'll start to get into some interior views in a second. Also, there was a certain kind of biomimicry going at work. This wasn't our original intention, but we started to notice that there were some other creatures that kind of have figured out ways to design and build like this. This was not our original inspiration, but we've kind of discovered this as we were working and found this interesting. This is one of the sweeps. If you extract that from the model, that is now inside the house. And we did a whole series of prints and models that are throughout our office. If you come to the office tonight after the talk, you'll get a sense of this. How am I doing on time? Yeah, 6:30. So these series of models basically started to develop the design language for the residents, and it was iterative, and it went over about a 2.5-year period. And we started to land on the final form of the house. This is one of those forms. This is where one comment we had from the BAR was from John Watson, who every time we went there asked, is it a hobbit house or a spaceship? And we said, John, that's for you to decide. Series of, again, these were different kind of progress models as we were working through and presenting to Bruce and Linda and coming up with a general strategy for the layout of the house. And now we're starting to hone in on areas that we call canyon lands. We started getting different names for different areas which exist on the top of the house going down there. This is, thank you, Bruce. This is a video that Bruce put together. Actually, we'll kind of fly people through the house here. That's that 5th elevation as you come over the top of the house. Eventually, what we're figuring is that drones are going to start flying around. Bruce has started to do drone views through the house. So these are paths that are like drone paths through the structure and the model that he's doing now as we work. And what's really great about these, we're going to go fast, but what's great about them is that we're using them in the design process. We're identifying places. Wow, you went really fast, Bruce. We're identifying places in the design that need work or are resolved or unresolved. And there's a lot of different little spaces to discover. Working digitally like this has started to clue us in on later, when the house is built, different paths we might take with drones throughout the house. When we're photographing projects now, we're using drones to actually photograph them. There's Linda in her kitchen. And I think these have been helpful for Bruce and Linda to really understand what they're getting. And I can't help but wonder if Nancy or Bill or Joan had a chance to actually experience her house as graphically, carefully rendered as this, what impact that might have had on the design. Because these have definitely had an impact on the design as we've worked through. Bruce and Linda have come with comments that have been very helpful comments to the development of the structure. I think this one's where we end. No, we're still going through. there's a whole, not only is there an interest in the house from the top, bottom, and sides, but we're thinking as a holistic object from all sides, all views, right? We've looked at it upside down, we've looked at it sideways, we've looked at it every way possible.
This is the last one. Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. The process by which to do this, by the way, I'm going to keep moving here because these are some images from those as we were working in the interior. We're interested in the back of house, so you see these forms. We're also interested in what's going on behind those forms. So this goes back to this notion about how it's built. It has two sides. It has a front of house and back of house, kind of a stage and backstage. And the backstage is as interest to us as the front stage is. We're doing high-def renderings of all the rooms and all the furnishings and so on. This is a piece that Alex Rasmussen's here tonight. We're looking at doing this aluminum piece that folds up and unveils the barbecue. Now I want to touch on the fact, well, one thing, you occupy the roof of the house as well. All within the height limit because we're essentially below the height limit. Figuring out the construction of this house has been interesting. We've been working with Gary Technologies, and every single element of the house is modeled. And in fact, the entire concrete shell of the building is a big digital model. We have actually not been doing any dimensioning of the building that I'm aware of. Greg, am I right about that? It's Gary Technologies and their model. Nobody's out there with a tape measure. They're all out there with these GPS units, and they're identifying all the corners and aspects of the house. It kind of freaks me out a little bit. We have steel going up, and I keep asking, did we check those steel shop drawings? And they're like, no, remember, the structural engineer did the steel shop drawings off the Tekla model, which is completely dialed in to the rest of the model. I'm having a hard time believing it. I'm still out in that trailer, with my phone. Ordering systems. One thing Gary Technology did is all of those forms and shapes that you see, they started to resolve the geometries of them, like how the bend, so that they're actually developable with different materials. And fortunately, Gary Technologies has been very helpful with that. Now, let me talk about Gary Technologies for a second. That guy, Frank Gehry, you saw on the Domus magazine cover, he figured out a company to help him build his buildings, and then that company now helps other architects build their buildings, which I think is a pretty smart thing to do. And then he sold it to somebody for a lot of money, and he's got a big sailboat. Massive structural analysis of the tendons and the structure for holding the building together. This is a little exploded axo of how the thing's going to be put together. We've broken down this is just the concrete, every concrete element and how it's going to be made, who's going to make it, the formwork. Glass as well. These are models of the model. This is this Tekla. The engineer's actually drawn every piece of rebar. Every single element, structural element in the building is modeled ahead of time. This is the mechanical systems. Again, all modeled ahead of time. All the clash detection done to make sure one pipe doesn't run into a duct and so on. This is then coincided with all the structure, the rebar. You've got things like this gets more and more dense and more populated with all the systems we make with buildings today. You can see where the toilets are going. You can see where all the drains are. You can see every element of the building is modeled prior to construction. Now, can you imagine when I was doing the Crawford residence? Oops, we're going to go back to that for a second. Had we had this, I was the clash detector. I was out there trying to figure out that, wait a minute, that beam is going to run into that piece of duct, but I had to stay up all night and do it. Now it all gets designed, modeled, and presumably during construction, this will all go together and fit together seamlessly. We're moving pretty fast now, and I'm starting to believe it. A lot of people ask about the concrete, how we're doing the concrete. every shape and form, piece of concrete is modeled three-dimensionally. Most of it's being built in New Hampshire, where they have the ability to actually bend these pieces and cut the billets and do all of those kinds of things. We actually have piles of MDF up there, that picture kind of in the middle and the top. That's actually stacks of MDF glued together and CNC cut to make some of these forms, to be able to do things like this. This is today. That's one of the walls going up. That's in that location there. And it actually is going up. We've been joking that Google or some satellite from Russia or something's going overhead and seeing this thing and is like, comrade, there's something going on in Montecito. It's like, somewhere in Montecito. This is a quick one of construction. By the way, these are movies that Bruce has been putting together, which has been really terrific. The construction is slated to take, I think it's 28 months. Greg, is that right? Which for a building like this is very, very fast with the complexity of the construction. Matt Construction is doing it. They built the Broad down in LA and a lot of very significant buildings. Their team, we have a big team of people on this. We have OAC, construction meetings, might be 20, 30 people in the room. And all of these systems all being coordinated, built. This is pretty recent. This area dropping down here, that's the theater. It's on the background, the pile of dirt. And I have to say, the commitment to this, the fact that this is coming into the community, and especially of what Montecito's gone through, and to go ahead and do this is just a fantastic thing. Eventually what's going to happen is all these walls are going to start going up, and you're going to have this big concrete shell. And there's going to be a period where people are going to drive by and they're going to go, what the heck's going on over there? But eventually, when the dirt comes in and the dirt piles over it and it all gets planted out, it's going to go back. People are going to get it, that what the real intention is. But we're going to go, like a teenager, we're going to go through a few awkward years before it comes into full bloom. And I think really over the years what will happen is the house is going to just evolve and settle into the landscape and just get better and better, much the way Bill and Joanne's house has and the Alexander residence has. These homes, in my opinion, get better and better with time. And one of the great things about doing concrete, of course, is that concrete stands the test of time. Otherwise, we wouldn't build freeways out of it. And now the steel's starting to go up. This is where I got nervous. How do I know that that's the right height? The ability to do this now, we are now applying this to the major projects that we're doing. We're doing a series of very significant residences, fortunately, and we're doing apartment buildings and so on. But this kind of technology and the ability to visualize everything three-dimensionally, to work out all of the details and so on ahead of time, this is now common to us. And working on this project has helped us gain more strength within the studio to do that. And eventually will bear fruit in terms of efficiencies in construction and so on. So a couple things. I'm just going to finish here by comparing these three houses. I think an interesting one is the scale. These are the scale of the houses, and in general what's happened is that homes have gotten bigger for a whole bunch of reasons. I think any architect in the room will agree with that, and there's lots of stats on this and so on. But the demands, I think, for how people live and want to live and have the option of having the gym in their home, have their office in their home, have a theater in their home. These are lovely options that people are taking on, and has to do with how people are living and how they're interacting with the community. I think also this notion of the geometry, I think the geometry comparisons are interesting in terms of the cardinal points and things like that, building the buildings on grids, the motif, the circular motif. I didn't start out on a circular motif with Bruce and Linda's house thinking, oh, it was a good idea at Crawford, let's do it here. But somehow I think that was kind of embedded in my brain as we were working through it. Also, this notion of front yard, backyard. Your traditional house has a backyard, has a front yard. All three of these homes disrupt that idea. They're actually surrounded, the notion of being surrounded by territory and the kind of creating your private family area within the territory and being able to define that has been an important part of each of these houses. Sorry, guys. Same with the Crawford residence. There's this notion of this territory around the house. Even though the property lines, we weren't interested in the property lines. What we were interested in was this circle. And outside of the circle were the wilds, the territory of Santa Barbara. And inside was this sort of private area, this ownership. I lord over this area. The rest of it are the wilds. I think even with Bruce and Linda's home is a similar notion that, but in their case, we occupy the center, where in the Morphos's house, we pushed up to the periphery and we left the center open. So, and the same with the Alexander residence, occupied the center. So there's also, interestingly, when I look at the three of them, these are diagrams I did just very quickly. This motif of the circle kind of lives on and started with the Alexander residence, but I don't remember Tom ever talking about, well, they did it up there, we're going to do a circle. That isn't where that came from. It came from another kind of mentality around how do we have a dialogue about front, side, back, and so on, and how does a structure live on a site and occupy a site. Also sectionally, these are sections through the house, how the one to the left's Alexander residence burrows into the hill, topographically integrated. The Crawford residence floats above. Bruce and Linda's house completes the hill and actually will feel like it's burrowing, but it's really completing. So a couple quick, this is a little dangerous, but I think this is interesting. Size, we've got 7,300, 8,700. This is how you keep score. Pepper Hill, 12,500. There's an asterisk there. Might be a little bit bigger. Cost. I always get asked this. Alexander residence, according to Roland Code in an interview, he estimated about $75 a square foot in mid-70s. Bill and Joanne's house, I remember the dictate was $100 a square foot. And I think we creeped over it a little bit by the end. Bruce and Linda's, just take my word on it, more. And it's not just Bruce and Linda's house, but construction in general has gone up exponentially. And I don't see it reversing, by the way. We have all kinds of issues around construction today, but buildings and significant buildings are not going to get cheaper anytime soon. Time to build, Alexander residence and Crawford residence, planning and building, about the same. Although I know the Alexander residence, you ran into a real problem, you talked about, Nancy, with getting permission to even build up on the site, and you guys got stalled there for a while. So it might be more like 4.5 years, something like that, from what I could determine. Bill and Joanne's house moved fairly smoothly. Pepper Hill has actually moved pretty smoothly. It just is going to take longer on the construction side due to the scale of the residence and so on, but it's moving pretty well. Architect's fees, always get asked. I'm guessing probably $1975, probably somewhere in that ballpark. I know this because Tom used to talk about his fees all the time. And at the time, that seemed like a hellacious amount of money in the night. At that, when I was making $1,200 a month working for Tom. And Pepper Hill residents, all I can say, worth every penny. Consultants, this is a funny one. I estimated on the Alexander residence 2, maybe 3 consultants, mainly geology and structural. I'm not even sure landscape. Did you a landscape architect? Okay, there's 3. Probably electrical engineer, right? Mechanical, 4 or 5. About the same with the Crawford residence. Pepper Hill. Actually, that's not the whole list. Yeah, we have a typo here. There's actually 21 on the Pepper Hill residence. Again, not unusual. The other residences we're doing are all in that same ballpark. You look at them, civil, media, interior, landscape, theater, kitchen. This is normal, folks. But I find it very interesting because it kind of speaks to what it takes to get buildings done and societally, what's going on. So, a couple things. Santa Barbara Architecture, everybody know this book? I think it's interesting to go back and look at these books and see what they have to say. Both Alexander residents, Crawford, are in the books. This guy shows up again. He has something to say about the Crawford residence, which I think is pretty funny. He says, the Crawford house, designed by Venice, California firm of Morphosis, 1989. He was wrong on 2 things. We're not Venice and not 1989. Is by intent primarily a theoretical and intellectual artifact. Thanks a lot. But he wasn't too far off the mark. This came from Nancy. Alexander residence. He said it was romantic in the best sense of the word. I put that out because this mattered in those times before David passed away, I think 96. His opinion mattered, especially up here. And we were interested in what he had to say. Another book there's been numerous books about the Crawford residence. This one I find the most beautiful, which has the essay, the photographs by Kim Zwarts, Dutch photographer. But I thought what Tom Main wrote here was pretty interesting. He said, I wish to acknowledge Bill and Joanne Crawford for entrusting me with the design of their home. Among all possible commissions, a house in particular is never solely informed by the architect's vision. There is simply too much risk at close proximity. Bill and Joan managed to tread the very fine line between building a house that would satisfy their needs for comfort and self-expression, and at the same time embarking on and participating in a formal exploration of architecture. This goes back to my comment about courage, because that's really what's going on here. You're pushing the envelope, and these 3 homes did that. I'm going to wrap up just for a minute here. I mentioned before about artifacts. One of the things that I'm very interested at this stage of my career is the byproducts of the design process. And obviously drawing and model making is part of this, and also the objects that we make as buildings are being built. I think architects need to really pay attention to what they're doing and look at the nature of the process and how do we take it a step further. One of the things I'm doing here, you see on the left here, this is a series of lithographs that are based on the geometries, in this case, from Bruce and Linda's house. Now, one of the reasons I'm bringing this is because I want to see these projected up here large on a screen. So I'm a little bit self-serving. But there's this amazing geometry and working with the computer, and how do we take it out of the digital and start to work with it from an analog standpoint and actually start to produce something that might be just as valid as the building it came from, if not actually, in my case, I find it just as interesting, if not more interesting. I get to own it and possess it and work with it. These wouldn't come about without the building. And more this aspect of, of creating these documents. I don't know what they're for. I don't know if they're art or what they are, and I don't really care. But we're producing them, and we're going to continue to produce them. And there's variations on a theme. All of the geometry is pulled out of the digital model and worked with in different ways. The prints were done, these are monoprints, they were done in just a whole series of, like in a day. It was kind of an improvisational attempt. The first ones were from Woodley. This is from another house down in LA. And like I said, I just kind of wanted to see them projected. But the nature of how we practice, how we take seriously what we're making, and can it go further and live on is really interesting to us. This is a photo from we put these up just before Christmas here in Santa Barbara, and this is from another house as well. So it's a series of 3 houses, not the 3 we talked about tonight, but another. Bruce and Linda's and another 2. So I'm just going to end on this. I thought that this was pretty interesting. There was a quote. This is from the PA magazine that did the article on the Alexander House. And Thomas Hines, who wrote this, he snuck this in at the end. And this was from a poet from 1948. And it spoke to what I think an attitude or a sense about these projects. So he wrote, the poet did, "Art being bartender is never drunk, and magic that believes itself must die. Being absurd as well as beautiful, magic, like art, is hoax redeemed by awe." And I thought that was interesting. Thomas Hines put in that it hits on a number. In a certain sense, these homes push so many buttons and raise so many questions that you start to wonder. And yet, there's something beautiful, and I think they'll be enduring for a lot of different reasons. And I know Bruce and Linda's house will be, and I know the other 2 are. So I want to appreciate you guys going on this little journey with me tonight. I've been thinking about this for a while, these 3 houses.